Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on inclusive civic engagement. My name is Lorna McHugh, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ontario Healthy Communities Coalition. This is the third in HC Link's three-part series on civic engagement. The first webinar was Engaging Citizens for Healthy Communities, Current Challenges and Approaches. The second was an introduction to engaging in the review of your official plan. Recordings of these webinars are available for viewing, along with slides and resource materials on the HC Link website. I'd be interested in knowing how many of you attended either of these previous webinars. Helen is going to put up 2 questions on the screen. Please click on yes or no to record your answer. Did you attend or view the recording of Engaging Citizens for Healthy Communities? And secondly, did you attend or view the recording of an introduction to engaging in the review of your official plan? I'll give you a minute to get as many in as we can. That's interesting. It seems like most people did not attend the previous 2, which is fine. I'm just kind of curious whether it makes a difference when we offer webinars packaged as a series or whether people are actually more interested in the individual topics, which I think is the case. So that's great. Thanks for that. The previous 2 webinars discussed various types and examples of civic engagement. In today's webinar, we're going to look at ways in which we can promote and support inclusive civic engagement. We all know that over the past few decades, there's been a decline in community life for many different reasons. More people are experiencing financial pressures and are dealing with precarious work situations and juggling competing demands. Suburbanization, increased home entertainment options, and higher rates of mobility are also contributing factors. Many people feel disconnected from public policy development and decision-making. And socially vulnerable groups such as Indigenous peoples, immigrants, refugees, racial and cultural minorities, people with disabilities, and economically marginalized groups often find it difficult to participate effectively in political life. We're fortunate to have 3 presenters with us today who will share their knowledge and experience on this topic. But first, I'd like to take just a few minutes to consider some definitions and context. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about civil society. Strong civic engagement, of course, leads to a strong civil society, which is essential for a vibrant democracy and for building and sustaining the social capital needed for a healthy community. A healthy community embraces diversity and promotes equitable inclusion for all in all of its social, economic, political, and cultural spheres. Civil society is comprised of groups and organizations working for public interest but operating outside of the government and for-profit sectors. Civil society includes labor unions, nonprofit organizations, churches, service clubs, and other service agencies. I came across a couple of quotes from the Canadian Policy Research Network that speak to this point. In a vibrant democracy, voluntary organizations are themselves spaces for the exercise of citizenship and conduits for connecting citizens to government. Effective citizen involvement not only promotes the direct participation of individuals in policy processes, it also encourages the development of strong associational networks with active democratic memberships. These serve as intermediary sites of deliberation and as vehicles for collective action that link citizens to policy processes. Now, I'd like to take a minute to distinguish between civic engagement and community engagement. I've seen in the literature that there are many different definitions used, and both have been ascribed the same continuum, from informing to consultation, collaboration, and empowerment. But I think there is a difference, and I like the definitions provided by Animating Democracy. They see civic engagement as referring to ways in which people participate in civic, community, and political life and contribute to the improvement of their neighborhood, community, and nation. It includes volunteering, voting, organizing, and advocacy. In other words, it's self-initiated and self-directed activity for the benefit of the community. Community engagement, on the other hand, is initiated by a municipality, institution, or organization. It refers to ways organizations engage constituents in the public in order to align their organizational goals, programs, and services with community interests and needs. But although civic participation is predominantly self-directed, we recognize that many people find it difficult to participate effectively in the civic arena. So it's important for municipalities and other civil society organizations to provide the education, support, and encouragement needed to ensure everyone has the opportunity to be involved at the level they desire. And there are many forms of civic engagement. I like this organization, Animating Democracy, and they have a project called Fostering Civic Engagement Through Arts and Culture. They promote awareness of the social impact of arts-based civic engagement and social change. Many libraries see themselves as supporting civic engagement by providing a range of facilities and services, such as community meeting rooms, discussion groups, and research services. And let's not forget about service clubs. They play a tremendous role in our communities, building and operating recreational facilities, fundraising for special events, and meeting community needs. An extraordinary example of the power of civic engagement is the Thorncliffe Park Women's Committee, whose accomplishments have been documented by the Metcalf Foundation in this lovely booklet, which is available online. In the summer of 2008, a group of women who met in the park came to realize that they shared a desire to improve the park and the surrounding neighborhood. They had very little money, no political clout, and no business connections. But they created a partnership, they volunteered their time and energy, and they harnessed their collective power to overcome their obstacles. Having become empowered to create change for themselves and their community, they went on to improve the quality of green space in the park, they increased the recreational opportunities for their children, and they established social enterprises, including a bazaar and a food market. This webinar was developed as a result of concerns that many people experience barriers to participation in civic life. This afternoon's presenters will help us to understand how and why some people are excluded and what we can do to be more inclusive. You will hear how some municipalities are taking action to ensure they provide welcoming and safe places. Some of these initiatives are specifically directed at the voluntary sector. Not only is it important that the makeup of these organizations reflect the full range of community perspectives, but leadership positions in voluntary organizations are often stepping stones to other forms of community and political leadership. There'll be time at the end of the presentations, after all the presentations, for some questions, but I would like to remind you that you can put your questions in the chat box as you think of them, and then at the end of the presentations, we'll go through those, and hopefully the presenters will be able to answer them. Before I introduce our first presenter, I'd like to have an idea of your organization's level of involvement in diversity or inclusion initiatives. Here are 3 questions for you to answer. The first one is, we have addressed issues of diversity and inclusion in our strategic plan. So these are statements, and you can answer no, not yet, but discussing it, yes, or if it's not applicable, just don't vote. The second statement is, we have assessed our policies and practices to determine if they contain any barriers to inclusion. And the third question is, we have developed an action plan to eliminate or reduce barriers to inclusion. Well, it looks like this is a group that's very cognizant of diversity and inclusion issues, so that's nice to see. Looks like it's one thing to have it addressed in a strategic plan, but something a little different to have it actually in an action plan. So maybe this webinar will be able to help with some of that. I'll give you a minute for anybody who hasn't voted yet to click on the right response. I guess that's it. Thank you very much. That's very, very informative. Now I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter. Kathy Gallagher-Louisi is the Director of Knowledge Services for the Canadian Diversity and Inclusion. She provides research, training, and consulting services and is the author of a groundbreaking benchmarking report on diversity measurement in Canadian organizations, as well as a series of toolkits for diversity and inclusion practitioners. Kathy will take us through some of the key concepts in diversity, inclusion, and accessibility.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for responding to those poll questions. It's very helpful for us to understand where everyone is at in terms of their diversity journey within their organizations. Hello to everyone across Ontario and Canada. I see some people from Alberta and British Columbia, so welcome to all of you. I wanted to just frame this before I get started. Looking at some of your roles and the organizations that you work with and some of your answers to the poll questions that you just provided, some of the things I'm going to present right now might be already common knowledge to you, but I'm hoping that you'll walk away with something new or a new way of thinking about things. So just wanted to frame that before we get going. My agenda for today, very briefly, is just talking about some of the key concepts in diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, the imperative for inclusion for Canada and Ontario, some barriers to inclusion that we experience in organizations and in society, and some strategies to create an inclusive approach. And as I said, I've been asked to cover quite a lot in this presentation, so a lot of it will be at a high level, but there's lots and lots of resources out there if you want to delve deeper into any of these things. So getting into the key concepts, first of all, our organization undertook to develop our own definitions for diversity and inclusion. So we are an organization that supports diversity and inclusion in workplaces and schools, and also we have partnerships with universities and colleges as well for both teaching and research. So we developed some definitions, and we certainly encourage anyone to take our definitions and use them as they see fit or edit them for their organization. We think it's important for every organization to establish what it is they're actually talking about when they're talking about diversity and inclusion. So, and we take a broad approach to it. Many people, when you hear the word diversity, just think about race, and that's a very important part of it, but it's just one of many aspects of diversity and inclusion. So we think about diversity as being about the individual. It's about the variety of unique dimensions, qualities, and characteristics we all possess. Then inclusion is about the collective. It's about creating a culture that strives for equity and embraces, respects, accepts, and values differences. And valuing difference is part of the important part of inclusion. It's that the differences are not a problem. We actually value those differences for the different perspectives that they bring. Diversity and inclusion as a concept altogether is about capturing the uniqueness of the individual and creating an environment that values and respects individuals for their talents, skills, and abilities to the benefit of the collective. And this encompasses a number of things. So I want to talk about some verbiage that you often hear in the discussions around diversity. The word tolerance, I cannot tolerate the word tolerance. I wish it would go away. You know, things that we tolerate are things that essentially we're putting up with because we have to. You know, I tolerate going to the dentist. No offense to any dentists out there. I don't feel all warm and fuzzy when my husband says, oh dear, I tolerate you so much. We're not seeking tolerance. That is what people were seeking in the 40s and 50s and 60s in the civil rights movement. We're seeking inclusion. We're seeking being able to feel fully included in society and in our workplaces and in everything that we're trying to get involved with. So what exactly does inclusion look like? I like this visual representation because it just puts it so beautifully. Inclusion is being part of the whole, not being separated from it or segregated from it or being part of it but within a little group. Inclusion is being a part of the whole. So that's a nice, real, quick visualization for that. I want to talk about equality versus equity. So in our society, we like to believe in equality, but some of the reasons why we need to focus on equity is because we don't have equality in our society. So equality only works when you have a level playing field. So I'll give you a chance to just read this comic, which I think it illustrates things nicely. So you can see here a lot of our systems and processes in our society, in our workplaces, in our organizations, in our schools are designed with this idea that we're treating people equally because we're treating them all the same, regardless of their ability to be successful. And you can see in this particular example, most of the candidates here are not going to be successful in the task that's been presented to them. Another way to think about equality versus equity is this great visual. So in the first picture, equality, the participants here have been treated equally. They've all been given the exact same thing. In the second example, we have equity. So they have not been given the same thing, but now they're able to participate equally. So equality, treating everyone exactly the same, only works if we're starting from a level playing field, if we have equality in the first place. Sometimes we need equity. Sometimes we need accommodations to make sure that everyone can actually participate equally. Another way of thinking about this is equality is giving everyone a shoe, and equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. So when we're thinking about diversity as a broad concept, as I mentioned, many of us just think about race. So what I want you to do is take a moment to look through all of these items on this list and just answer in your head, or if you want to write down your answers, feel free to do that. But answer as many of these questions as you can about yourself. And then I'll take a moment to take that up. But I'll give you a minute to just read through the entire list and just answer the questions in your head, or you can write them down if you feel free, if you have a piece of paper handy. There's a couple of things to think about with each of the ways that you identify yourself on this page. And this is just a small list. We could have many, many more. For example, things that are not on here are the size of the family that you were in, or your birth order, or were you raised in a one or a two-parent family, or your first language, or whether you speak with an accent. All of these things are part of the complexity of our own diverse identities. And if you think about each and every one of these, there's a culture, there's a worldview that's associated with identifying yourself in this way. There's been some really interesting work that's been done in terms of looking at the culture of poverty versus the culture of wealth. And there's been some experiments that were done where you put people from people who make less money into wealthy situations, and vice versa, people who are more wealthy into more socioeconomically depressed situations. And in both cases, the people who are out of context don't know how to behave. They don't know what are the rules and the expectations and the standards. So all of these things show you that diversity is very complex, and it's we need to be very much aware that all of these things are at play, and many of these things are not visible. And a lot of the times what happens is when we see someone else, we identify them based on something that's visible about them. And we often assume that we know things about them because of that visible aspect of their diversity. But when you look at this for yourself, you can see that a lot of the way you identify yourself, a lot of the things that make you who you are not visible to other people. And when we just make assumptions about people based on that thing that we see, we can often, very strongly stereotype people. I also want you to think about some of the ways in which you may be privileged or underprivileged in some of the things that you answered here. We can experience both privilege and oppression at the same time, depending on different ways that we identify. So we need to be very aware of how these things intersect when we're looking at diversity and inclusion. Okay, accessibility. If we're going to talk about inclusive civic engagement, an extremely important part of this is accessibility, and that's making sure that everyone can participate. Accessibility is not just about making sure that a person in a wheelchair can access the space, although that is certainly a very important part of it. But accessibility is about making sure that everyone can participate in the ways that they need to participate. And I'm going to present you with a couple of different ways to think about accessibility and accommodation. Think about this. Spaces or systems are inaccessible because they're poorly designed. They have not been designed for the range of uses that humans need them for. So accessibility is strongly related to universal design, or what's now being referred to as inclusive design, which is the process of creating products and services and environments that are usable by people with the widest possible range of abilities, operating within the widest possible range of situations. So accommodation is an interesting thing, and some people say, oh, why should we have to make accommodation for people? If you think about this, one, it's a violation of people's human rights if we don't provide accommodation when they request it. And two, the lights that we use to see are an accommodation for those of us who need them to see. People who are blind don't need them. So think about all the money that we spend, the contribution to global warming of providing the accommodation of lighting the rooms that we're in. Yet because this is an accommodation for the majority, it's widely accepted as necessary. And it's when the accommodations are in place for not the majority that people balk at it. Now, if we just started off with universal design or inclusive design in the first place, accommodations would not be as necessary. But one of the things that's really amazing about accommodations and accessibility is it actually benefits everyone. And there's been a lot of research that shows that when you make buildings and environments more accessible for people with disabilities, they're actually easier for everyone to navigate. They're easier for people with wheelchairs. They're easier for people who have strollers. They're easier for people who may have just had knee surgery, whatever it be. When we create documents and websites that are accessible, they're actually easier to read and navigate for everyone. Accessibility in teaching and in providing communications means that we have multiple formats for people to receive information because we know people have different learning styles. And then when we talk about accessibility in events and classes, we make sure that everyone can be included. So what we're encouraging people to do is to plan everything that you're doing with accessibility in mind, whether it's events or classes or the services that you provide or your websites or your recruiting and employment processes or any documents and presentations that you have. There's some fantastic resources out there to help you with this. And here's a couple I would point to. One, Ryerson has a fantastic guide to accessible events with checklists, everything that you could possibly think about, and probably some things that you would have never thought of to make sure that your event is going to be accessible. And here at CCDI, we created a toolkit for the inclusion of people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It's called talkingasl.ca. It's a free website. Go and use it, please. If there are any services or other resources that are out there that we've missed, let us know because we'd love to add them. And this is, we developed this in conjunction with the Canadian Hearing Society to put together all the resources that we could find right across the country for the different ways that you can include deaf and hard of hearing people, including how do you find somebody to do sign language at your event or a number of other different kinds of things. So please take a look at that. Talking about the imperative for inclusion for Canada. First of all, no, this is not upside down. This is the projected labor force supply for Canada going into the future. So what we have here, and I apologize for the kind of dry StatsCan statistics, but they're important for us to frame the conversation. So in the fuchsia bars, we have a projection based on high population growth. In the red bars, we have a projection based on medium population growth. And in the lighter pink bars, we have a projection based on low population growth. No matter what the population growth happens in the next few years, Canada is going to face a massive talent shortage. This comes from some research by Rick Miner. He has actually put out three documents in 2010, 2012, and 2014, and all of it is about Canada's labor force. And what is really important about this, we have reached negative natural increase in Canada, meaning we're not having enough babies to replace ourselves. So all of our population growth now is coming from immigration, and we are experiencing this projected loss in our talent pools in Canada because so many people are about to retire and leave the workforce. So what this is telling us is that, by 2026 and 2031, we're going to have a shortfall in our labor force of between 1 million and 4 million people, meaning so many people are going to leave the workforce, there won't be enough people left to replace them. Now, this has incredible impacts for Canada's economy. The dependency ratio, in case you're not familiar with this idea, is the ratio of people who are technically able to work, those between 15 and 65, to the ratio of those who are technically dependent, who are under 15 or over 65. It doesn't take into account unemployment rates of the people who are technically in the age group able to work. So you can see here that in 2010, the dependency ratio for Canada was 44%, but the projection is that for 2036, the dependency ratio is going to be 65%, meaning there'll be one working person for every 2 dependents. This is simply not financially sustainable. And so Rick Miner's conclusions here is that we need to make sure that we are ensuring greater workforce participation from many currently underrepresented groups who exist in Canada who are underrepresented in our workforce. And that includes visible minorities or racialized people, youth, people under 25, people with disabilities, and Aboriginal peoples, and in certain areas, women as well in certain industries. And we know that all the population growth is coming from immigration. We need it basically for our economy not to collapse. So we need to do a better job of integrating the available talent we have here in Canada, and we need more immigrants coming to Canada. So this is part of the rationale for why we need immigration and why we really need to have a concerted effort to focus on inclusion. There's an interesting StatsCan study that just was reported in the news on Monday that shows that immigrants are actually offering job creators. A greater percentage of immigrants than Canadian-born people are starting companies. Now, the dark side of that statistic is that is partly due to the discrimination they face when they try to enter the Canadian workforce, so they decide to start their own companies to compensate. An important piece for all of us here in Ontario is that the majority of immigrants are coming to Ontario, and interestingly, what is happening is, although most people settle in the Golden Horseshoe, so that's the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, what is happening within Ontario is there's a lot of intra-provincial migration, which means that most of the population growth from other areas throughout Ontario is coming from the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, which are already incredibly diverse. So the diversity of Ontario as a whole is going to continue, the racial diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity is going to continue to increase as we move forward. Why is it important to talk about inequality? The World Economic Forum has put out this report in 2013 that tells us that 7 out of 10 people in the world today live in countries where inequality has increased over the past 3 decades, and that inequality undermines social stability and threatens security on a global scale. And one of the things that we know for sure in tons of research is that inequality disproportionately affects certain groups in our society. And here are some stats on that. In terms of women, it's, you know, we've been talking about the advancement of women and equality of women for decades and decades. In Canada, women have been earning more than half of all university degrees since the 1979-1980 school year, and yet still here we are 35 years later, and women are still making 73.5 cents for every dollar a man makes. That was just reported in the Globe and Mail this month. When looking at immigration, university-educated immigrants are underutilized. StatsCan tells us they earn on average $23.3 thousand a year compared to Canadian-born university grads who make $78.9 thousand a year on average. And according to a report by RBC Economics, the cost to our economy of underutilizing and underpaying skilled immigrants is $30.7 billion with a B dollars per year. So it has a huge impact on our not only just incredibly social justice and fairness, but also on the economy and the success of our country. Looking at disability, this is from Rethinking Disability in the Private Sector, which was put out by Employment and Social Development Canada. There are 795,000 working-age Canadians with disabilities whose disability would not prevent them from working, who are not employed, even though nearly half, 340,000 of them have post-secondary educations. I could probably pull out, you know, a dozen more stats about any of these particular groups. There was a report from Common Front Ontario, a coalition of groups, that indicated that poverty is rising in Ontario and is disproportionately affecting certain groups, and especially racialized people. I believe I've just lost my connection to the webinar, so if you guys can hear me, I'm going to ask someone to, it seems to be returning. My apologies. Is everyone else seeing problems with the webinar?
It's sort of here. It's fine on my side.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to advance the screen in a second then if mine does not come back, okay? Looking at racialized people, we can see that there's a report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that was released in 2011 that shows that a racialized person makes 81.4 cents for every dollar that a white person makes. Now, when you factor in racialized immigrants or racialized women or immigrant women of color, the gaps become enormous. And they've also found that many racialized women and racialized immigrants are working poor. In Ontario, 25% of the workforce works at minimum wage. However, that number jumps to 38% for racialized women. And by the way, Ontario's minimum wage is below the low income cutoff if you're working full-time at minimum wage, or what is commonly referred to as the poverty line. Aboriginal unemployment, I could pull out a dozen stats about this as well, is twice that of non-Aboriginal Canadians, and we're just presenting some of the ways in which inequality is disproportionately distributed amongst different people. Could you advance the slide, please, Lorna? Okay, I'm going to assume the slide has advanced because I'm still having difficulty with connecting on the web. So the benefits of an inclusive society. There's a fantastic report from GSDRC called Benefits to Society of an Inclusive Societies Approach. And they've identified 3 important benefits: economic growth, productivity, and employment. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that inclusive growth approaches to reducing poverty and inequality actually benefit the economy overall. Societal development outcomes and including well-being are an important piece of an inclusive society. So there's a lot of really great studies that show that making services more inclusive improves progress towards the Millennium Development Goals that were issued by the United Nations. And also there's lots of evidence that shows that reducing inequality has incredible impacts on education and health. And we know that income and education are 2 of the biggest social determinants of health. Also, social cohesion, peace, and state building. There is a lot of evidence that shows the link between peaceful societies that are more inclusive, and that inclusive political systems create more peace and harmony within a society. If you could advance the slide again, please. We're on talking about barriers to inclusion. If so, could you advance the slide again, and we should be on the slide called bias. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to try and refresh my screen if I can while I'm on here. Bias. What is bias? It's a preference or an inclination, especially one that inhibits impartial judgment. So if we could please advance to the next slide, which is on the types of bias. And it's working now. Thank you. Okay, I had to refresh. Pardon me for my technical difficulties, everyone. So it's very interesting when you look at psychologists who've been studying this for decades have identified that there are 3 major types of biases. Now, we have dozens of biases operating in our brains at any given time, seriously, dozens of them. We just need simply to be aware that we have biases. And so a lot of people will talk about unconscious bias. Now, we have conscious and unconscious biases, and we just need to admit that and actually learn what they are and work to overcome them. So we have 3 different kinds of biases: decision-making, belief, and behavioral biases, which are the ones that affect the formation of our beliefs and our business and economic decisions and human behavior in general. Then we have social biases and attributional biases. And these are what we call judgment errors when we try to evaluate or find reasons for our own and others' behavior. We do this constantly. So we're frequently wrong when we try to assume the intentions of others, and our biases will influence how we observe and assess others' behaviors and intentions. So that's a frequent thing that happens, especially in workplaces and in society, where it leads to people, dismissing others or blaming them for the situations that they find themselves in. Memory errors and biases in cognitive science, these are ones that will affect either your chance that a memory will be recalled at all, or the amount of time it takes to be recalled, or the quality of the recollection, which is one of the reasons why eyewitness testimony is universally regarded as flawed, because we often remember what we want to remember, not necessarily the objective reality of what actually happened. So there's tons and tons of biases operating in our brains. Actually, if you want to go and Google cognitive biases, it's just remarkable the number of biases that are happening in your brain at any given time. We just need to acknowledge them. So and apparently I don't have presenter status anymore, so could you advance the slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so we have different levels of bias. We have conscious biases. Those are ones that are public, that we would express to others, and ones that are private, that we might consciously think about, but we don't express in public, or we might only express them to people who we think might agree with us. Some examples of public bias could include fat shaming, and I'm going to show you an example of another one in a moment. Unconscious biases are biases that are operating in our brains, but we're not aware of them, but they do affect our behaviors and judgments. And there are ways that you can go and test this. There's the Harvard Implicit Association Test, which I strongly recommend you go and test yourself. It can test you on a number of different types of biases, and will give you results about where your biases lie. It's extremely important that we're aware of them. The next slide, please. Lorna or so. Oh, no, it hasn't gone forward yet. Lorna or someone, thank you. Great. Objects of bias. As expected, pretty much every dimension of diversity can be an object of bias or any type of difference that exists between people. So in different groups, biases can emerge against certain people or for certain people for a number of different attributes. If we could advance again, please. And Helen, if there's any way you can advance me to a presenter again, that would be fantastic. Here's an example of conscious public bias. So the first caption says, if you do not study, you will end up like him. So she clearly has a bias blaming the person for the situation that they're in. The other person says to their child, if you study well, you will be able to make a better world for him. So just a very different way of approaching their reaction to this gentleman who's cleaning the street. And so that's just one of many, many, many examples of public biases that people are conscious of and willing to express publicly. If you could advance the slide again, please. Thank you. Oh, one back. Go one back to systemic discrimination slide. Oops. Too many people clicking the buttons. So systemic discrimination.
Kathy, it's Lorna here. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are running out of time for your segment.
Okay, I'll wrap it up.
Prompt you. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. So this is just a great example of the fact that in many cases our systems are designed by and for certain people without considering other people who might need to use them. So it's important that we think about how systems are designed and who they are designed to benefit. So if I could skip forward and we will I'm going to skip over the intersectionality one and go to overcoming your biases, please. Thank you. So we need to just simply acknowledge without guilt or blame that we have privileges and we have biases and that these exist and that we need to overcome them. We need to recognize when our own biases are operating and look for factual information that's inconsistent with our biases. And treat people as individuals and never treat someone as a representative of an entire group. Separate the individual from the group and avoid making assumptions about people. And the next slide, please. Developing an inclusive mindset should be the next slide. Thank you. Again, acknowledge that you have a worldview and biases that you need to overcome. It's really important that we establish friendships with different people and put ourselves in situations where we're going to encounter other cultural practices and learn about other people's lived experiences. Ask questions about other people's experiences and views. Listen and read as many different sources of information as we can. Risk making mistakes, learn to be an ally, and give people the benefit of the doubt. Most people are operating from a positive intentions, and we may become judgmental of them if the way they're going about things is different from what we expect. And one last slide on inclusive civic engagement, if you would advance, please. Thank you. I just wanted to highlight one thing really important is when you're doing any kind of program development, make sure that you're incorporating other people's perspectives, diverse perspectives, getting multiple people from different identity groups involved in the development of any kind of program development. It's really important that everyone's perspectives and lived experiences are honored and understood as we're developing interventions, because often we develop our programs and interventions in a bubble without consulting with people, and then they're not necessarily useful. So one of the phrases that you often hear coming from the Aboriginal community is nothing about us without us. So that will be my final statement for today. Thank you very much for giving me the time, and I'll pass it back to Lorna.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That was a wealth of information. I'm just amazed at how much you managed to cover in the time that you had. So thank you for that. We'll carry on now with our second presenter. Our next speaker is Rebecca Johnson, who's a councillor at large for the City of Thunder Bay. She has 26 years of political experience and has been recognized with numerous awards over the years for her commitment to Northwestern Ontario. She sits on more than 20 boards and committees, including co-chairing Diversity Thunder Bay, which she's going to tell us a bit about. Now, Rebecca, are you there? You will need to unmute yourself.
Yep,
I'm
unmuted.
Okay, there you go, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you very much. And you have my slides that are ready to go up?
I think Ellen's doing that now.
Welcome, everybody. It's nice to talk to people right across the country, and I'm very pleased to be able to talk about some of the things that we have done here in Thunder Bay in regards to a community organization. That's me on the screen, and welcome again. But I want to talk to you about our mission statement and our guiding principle, which is up there, and how we got to where we are with that particular mission statement and guiding principle. So we started back in 1991, and I have been involved all these years, and it came out of the Heritage Canada program, where there was a focus at the time to do something about March the 21st, which of course is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And at that time, the individual that was here, a program coordinator, said we need to do something about this day. So brought a group of individuals together for example, from our Lake House Social Planning Council, the Chamber of Commerce, the city itself, the library, the Indian Friendship Center, the Baha'i community, the Multicultural Association. We worked on that, and for the next 8 years we had flag raisings. You know, you go to the city hall and the mayor raises a flag, and then we had the odd time we would have something going on in regards to our shopping center and a little bit of promotional material. So over the next 8 years, as I've said, we talked about doing something but never came up with anything. Finally, in the year 2000, instead of standing out in the snow and the flag raising in the end of March, we decided that we really needed to take some solid steps and do something that would be changing our community, and it was important to do that. So we had a survey that was undertaken. Heritage Canada at the time provided us some dollars to go out and do a survey that looked at what kind of racism and discrimination that we had in our community. It was called the Community of Acceptance. It's on our, the reports I'm going to mention today are on our website, which is diversitythunderbay.ca. But anyway, out of the study came a resolution that we really needed to do something in regards to moving on diversity and what we could do something about it. So again, we looked at it very seriously, but understanding at that time, way back in the year 2000, although there's still a lot of hostility with regarding the discussion of racism, at that point there were a number of our corporate people, our political leaders, they were very uneasy, they were hostile, they didn't want to talk about racism, they felt it would show the city in a bad light, and so go away people, we don't really want to dealing with it, because talking about racism really is painful and it's very discouraging. But what we decided to do was, that was too bad. We knew we had racism in our community. It was growing, which is not what we want to have across the country, but it's there. And so how do we do it? So membership in Diversity Thunder Bay grew. We now have approximately 50 individuals and or organizations that are involved in the organization. It's not incorporated. It's just an organization of about 50 individuals. We charge $20 a year for membership, which helps us fund our organization. One of the things that we did in the early 24, I think it was 2004, was we received a fair amount of dollars from the for some funding to look at policing services. There was some big issues, and there unfortunately still is systemic racism in the police services, and that's right across our country. So what did we do about that? We did, again, funding from Canadian Heritage at the time. We did diversity training. We had a huge report that was developed, and from that became the template. And we feel very good about this for police services across the country, because we were the first ones that really started to look at systemic racism in police services. So we had that study done, and that was all good, and now we're still doing training with police services here in our community, etc. In 2006, we organized our first diversity breakfast, and I just want to put on my next thing so you can see some of the objectives that we've had over the years. But we decided that we needed to do something else again, and we had, this year we celebrated our 10th anniversary breakfast, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But going back to Diversity Thunder Bay, we developed in 2007 an actual terms of reference for the committee, because up from 2000 to 2007 we were a group that just kind of met and did all these great things, but we also decided we need to be a little more formalized, even if we were not going to incorporate. So we have a terms of reference. And that list that I showed you just previously about the guiding principles, we came up, and I call this the list of 20. If you look at the Ontario Human Rights, they have a list of 17, but I just think it's cool and it's kind of nice to say. We have a list of 20 various areas that we really try to address within Diversity Thunder Bay. So it goes beyond racism, and it's very important to look at that. So those are the objectives that we have with our organization. So how did we go about getting to where we are today? It was a fluky thing, actually. The Canadian Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination, which of course comes under the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and I was sitting at a council meeting one night, and we have a green file that circulates with a variety of information, and I saw something about this CMART, and I thought, well, what is that? Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination. I don't know very much about it. So I had a copy of that sent to me. And from that, I went back to Diversity Thunder Bay, and I said, you know, we should be part of this because it's talking about racism, it's talking about discrimination. What are we going to do about it? Got their support, went then to City Council and said we should join this. And you would think that was a motherhood issue, and it would be a very easy thing to do. Well, unfortunately, at the time, our community was not ready for that and said, we're not passing it. City Council of the day said, no, I lost the vote. So I went back out to the diversity, I went to the community and said, we've got to do something about this. We've got 2 weeks because it comes back in our city agenda for formal approval and ratification. And we had deputations. I think we had 6 or 7 deputations at the time, and we were able to turn the vote over, and we joined the municipality, or the Federation of Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination. That was a real starting point of where we went. And that was so, so important, because if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't be where we are today. So what I say about that is that we went and we developed a strategic plan for the city. From Diversity Thunder Bay, we took on, because the city really didn't want to do anything about this. They said, okay, you've got this and all the rest of it, and yeah, fine, we're part of this because you got the vote on it. But we, as the Diversity Thunder Bay, went back out and said, we've got to do something about this. Now we're part of this. How do we do that? We had, again, went back and got some funding and looked at what we call the Thunder Bay Committee Against Racism and Discrimination. We took the CMART and used their title, but we pulled forward a report on the Thunder Bay Plan of Action, and it came out in 2009, and that was our decision of where we were going to go. And from that, one of the recommendations was that we would have a City of Thunder Bay Advisory Committee established on racism. And that was really made it to help where we are today. And I think that that's the most important thing, is that as we were the advocacy group in the community that said the city has to do something about this. And that evolved. It was interesting when, I just want to share this with you across Canada, because you have to evolve. And that when we started this, we were the advisory committee on racism. That was how it was set up from the city. Well, you don't want a committee on racism, and that didn't sound very good. So what we did do, we changed it about 3 months after we started it to the advisory committee on anti-racism. And we've dealt in, since 2010 is when we started that. So you can see how long things take when you have to look at social change. It takes a long time. But anyway, from that, this past November, we've changed the committee name again, and I'll explain that. It's the Advisory Committee on Anti-Racism and Respect. Because we talk about racism, but we also have to look at the other forms of discrimination, of which I go back to my list of 20. And so for the city to say, well, we just want to talk about racism, no, we can no longer just talk about racism. It's one of a list of 20. So moving our advisory committee to accept the title of Anti-Racism and Respect was a huge, huge step forward. So we were eventually going to get to all of those other lists of 20 within that particular group. One of the things that, I mean, we've done a lot of work over the years. I remember one time when way back in 2003, we talked about incidents. We have people throwing eggs, for example, at Aboriginal people, lots of slurs, lots of things that happen in our community, which I'm assuming also happen across the rest of the country. But at the same point in time, what do? We've got these incidents, and how do we report them? And it's taken us from 2003, believe it or not, 2003, when we started talking about incidents, to 2016, where it is now in the city's action plan to actually do something about it. And we're going to work with our 211, and that's in various communities across Canada. So, you know, where you can get information if you dial 211 about the community. And we are going to start actually identifying the incidents that we have, so we have a baseline of what's going on in our community, because right now we know this is happening, but we really have no base, we have no data that identify that. So 211 is going to work with us, and we're going to be able to provide that baseline and then start working on some of the issues. Are they all happening in one part of the community, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that we started is a respect award. So we have given it out. We just gave it out yesterday for the fourth time, and we have an award. And I'm just putting up my last screen, or my last screen, is it about programs that we've done. We had a community workshop a year ago. We brought in a speaker from Saskatoon and talked about shifting the lens. How do we move our community forward? We had about 175 people from the community. We just opened it up, said, we have a problem with racism. What are we going to do about it? Becky came in and talked about what they do in Saskatoon. From that, we developed some steps, and we have a list of recommendations that we are working on now. We have 6 recommendations that we are working on, areas that we need to identify and actually put some substance behind those. We have had a couple of workshops since then, but I think that the most important thing, we have an action plan, and I'm not putting that up because it's about 3 pages long, and I didn't do that, but if anybody that's on the webinar today would like a copy of that, I would be more than happy to share that action plan with you of what we're doing this next year. One of the things I would like to identify is the Walk a Mile film project. This was done, and it's a series of 5 films that are approximately 20 minutes each, and you can actually go through, and it's dealing with Aboriginal or Indigenous people and some of the things that have happened with them, and it's a very good discussion item. This is being basically sold across the country now. School boards are buying it. The human rights are using it and promoting it in Ontario. It's really an opportunity to be able to talk about some of the issues, because if we don't do things through conversation, where will we go with this? And it's very, very important that we do deal with that. I want to tell you about our breakfast yesterday. This was our 10th anniversary. We had Stephen Lewis, who was our guest speaker. He came in and gave a very passionate, to 500 people. We sold the event out. Yeah, we had a waiting list of another 40 or 60 people. It was huge. The community supports this. Over the 10 years that we've had this, we started off with about 100, but to have 500 people come to hear Stephen Lewis, to identify in our community that we have a racism problem, that we have a discrimination problem, that we need to work on this, is huge. And so I think that's the most important thing that I can leave you with today, is that we are working on racism. We're working on discrimination issues, and what I've given you is just very much of a very high capsulization of some of the issues, but it's so important to get the community involved. It can't be done through the city. I sit as a city councilor. I'm on the Anti-Racism Respect Committee, and that has its advantages, but it's the community that's going to make the difference in what evolves in this whole area of racism and discrimination and inclusion. And that's where the advocacy comes from. And I always end my presentations, I'm not going to sing it for you today, but I could. But there's a song that comes from Sesame Street, and this is what, to me, is what it's all about. We are the people in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood. We are the people in your neighborhood. We're the people that you meet when you're walking down the street, and we're the people that you meet each day. That's what it's all about in Canada, and that's what it's about in Thunder Bay. And we've taken some great strides forward, and we're going to continue to do that. And I just am very pleased to be able to talk to you about our story this afternoon. So, Lorna, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. I admire your passion and the amount of energy that you have, and I really am very happy to hear about the progress you've made. I know it takes a long time, and you've stuck with it, and that is just wonderful.
Thank you.
Our final presenter is Johanna O'Teague. She's the Program Manager of Diversity on Board at the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion. And this program connects qualified candidates from visible minority and underrepresented communities to volunteer board positions. Also provides training in board governance. Johanna, would you like to tell us about your program?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, Lorna, and thank you. I would like to say welcome to everybody. I would like to go ahead and start, and I'll be talking about, I'll give a short history of HCCI, and then our vision and mission, and what we have accomplished so far, and then I will present Diversity on Board as an example of a civic engagement program. When HCCI, when it started, if you remember, just days after the 9/11 attack in the U.S., a Hindu temple was burned to the ground in Hamilton, and it was a hate-filled act that brought the city into headlines across the world. But what began as a case of mistaken identity, because the people who burned the Hindu temple, they thought it was a mosque. It became a force for positive change. What happens after is, as a response, 70 representatives from diverse faith groups and community organizations came together to brainstorm, and they formed what at the time they called Strengthening Hamilton Communities Initiative. And at that time, the purpose was to deal with the distress in the community because of that incident. However, after a long time and everybody felt that a long-term solution was needed to address issues of racism and hate crime. And that's how HCCI was established as a result in 2006. And the purpose was to develop a civic resource center to create an inclusive and welcoming city through respecting diversity, practicing equity, and speaking out against discrimination. So the mandate at that time and now as well, it is to support the city of Hamilton and its major institutions, businesses, and service providers to initiate and sustain process which promote equity and to make Hamilton a more welcoming and inclusive environment for everybody, to develop and share training and educational resources with the community, to provide the community with access to relevant information and research on diversity and inclusion issues, and to support newcomer immigrants and refugee communities, other marginalized groups, and diverse ethno-racial and ethno-cultural groups, and Aboriginal communities as well. So far, HCI has been facilitating in developing partnership between key institutions, the city, and diverse communities. For example, the employment sector, education, health, and housing. And we also developed different research and we provided information dissemination on hate crime prevention. On civic engagement, we engage newcomers through training on civic participation. Our conversation cafes are very popular, and they bring citizens from different walks of life to engage them with elected politicians and have a different discussion on different issues. We also provide youth leadership trainings. We support ethno-specific associations and organizations, and we provide workshops and trainings on diversity and inclusion that includes for businesses as well. We also facilitated the development of Made in Hamilton immigration strategy, the social inclusion strategy for poverty reduction, hate crime prevention guide, newcomer guides to services, and all these are available on our website if you visit that. And our current focus, and we are trying to focus on turning the talk into tangible results to enhance civic participation. So we currently have 3 programs that we are focusing on. The first one is called Advantage Diversity. This is a workplace transformation diversity training for business and organizations. The second one is Anti-Racism Resource Center, which just got approved by the city this last November. And it is a partnership between McMaster University, the City Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, and HCCI. It's going to the center actually will officially open. It was launched last month, and it officially opened in June. And the third one, which I'm going to be talking about in detail, is Diversity on Board, which is increasing diversity in governance. So Diversity on Board, Diversity on Board began back in 2005 when Maitri Foundation developed a solution to address the lack of diversity at public agencies, public agency boards, and commissions. Diversity is rising and multiplying in Canada. Its most visible feature derives from the increasing ethnic and racial diversity, particularly in large urban centers, and we have heard about the figures from the previous presentation. Yet, while our cities are becoming increasingly diverse, urban leadership, be it political, social, cultural, or economic, has not caught up to the demographic reality. So that means the face of leadership is not reflecting the composition of population we have. So, for example, back when they started the Diversity on Board program, they did a research at Ryerson University, and at the GTA area, even though the population is almost 50% visible minority, only 13% of leadership position was occupied by visible minorities. So why is there this poor representation at the governance level or at nonprofits and public agencies? Most of the time it is board recruitment, and usually it happens through networks. And there is a trust issue, so board members are recruited from within the board's social network. And usually, as it is now, the racial makeup of existing members is homogeneous. Board members tend to be older and wealthier, so in most cases, the social network of this individual doesn't include minority. So because of the lack of social ties and networks, people from visible minority and immigrant communities don't get the opportunity to apply for board positions. From my experience, after I started working on this project, there seems to be the need to diversify, but most organizations seem to be satisfied with a tokenistic representation of 1 or 2 people on their board, and that doesn't benefit anybody, including their own organization. Some organizations seem to think that they have to compromise on quality or talent of candidates if they consider diversity. So there is this stereotype, I can call it, that if we are going to bring diverse people, we might not get the qualified people. So diversity on board is trying to fill that gap. So it's a national program, so it's not just a Hamilton. It's happening in different cities in Canada. It's a national program that connects individuals from visible minority and underrepresented immigrant communities to volunteer board positions. So the goal, as I said, is to boost diversity at nonprofit and public agency boards. So far, the cities that are implementing this program are Toronto, Hamilton, London, Ottawa, Calgary, Vancouver, and Montreal. The success so far is more than 700 board appointments have been done through the connections we are creating. Actually, Diversity on Board received the United Nations Alliance of Civilization Intercultural Award for being a scalable, simple, result-oriented program. So why leadership matters at nonprofits and public agency boards? And it's not about representation only. It's not about tokenism. It actually has benefits, and different research showcase that reality. For example, a research from 2013 by Harvard Business Review found that diversity unlocks innovation and drives market growth. The author focused on two kinds of diversity: inherent diversity, which is traits one is born with, such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and acquired diversity, traits gained from experience, travel, learning, or studying another language in a different part of the world, or marrying a person not born in your country. They call this 2D diversity, and conclude that companies with a 2D diversity out-innovate and outperform others. And also on the other side, researchers at MIT turned the table on the benefits of diversity by asking not what diverse groups bring, but what do homogeneous groups miss. The author found that people working in homogeneous groups have a default assumption for like-mindedness, assuming that others look and think like they do. This leads to groupthink, which is not beneficial. So in respect to boards for nonprofits, what's the benefits? This is also based on a research by Conference Board of Canada. So a diverse board can bring diverse perspectives to the table, and that leads to better decisions, new ideas, and solutions. It also provides the organization, it makes it legitimize the mandate of the organization when it reflects the population that the organization serves on the leadership table. It enhances social cohesion, sense of belonging, and more civic participation from groups that are marginalized. It makes the organization more responsive to the community and client needs. And it also happens to be, it happens to support fundraising and marketing outreach more effectively. So how does Diversity on Board works? It's really simple. It provides affordable and accessible governance training to everyone. That's open to everyone. And everybody who joins our roster takes the online board governance training. So this is one way of avoiding tokenism. So we want people to meaningfully engage and participate. So it connects nonprofits and public boards to qualified individuals from diverse backgrounds. So the benefit is for both. Individuals get to, from diverse communities, get to increase their participation in civic and voluntary activities. And organizations get networked with talents from communities that they normally don't network with at that level. Usually, visible minorities and immigrants used to be client groups, and we don't see them at the leadership table. So generally, this contributes to creating a welcoming and inclusive community. We also provide diversity inclusion training. We also provide webinars on board effectiveness and in-person networking events. The diversity and inclusion training is open to organizations who join the program. It's called Embedding Diversity and Inclusion Principles into their board and organization. So all their leadership team can take this training because we want everybody to be ambassadors for diversity and inclusion as well. These are the organizations that are participating. So for if anybody is here and interested in knowing more, they can contact the organization. So for Vancouver, it is the L'Oreal Institution, Calgary, Bow Valley College, London in the area, Pillar Non-Profit Network. In Ottawa, it's Volunteer Ottawa. Montreal, Concertation Montreal, and Hamilton, it's us. And for Greater Toronto Area, the Diversity on Board National Program, that is the Ryerson University Global Diversity Exchange Office. So that's what I have, and if you would like to learn more, there was the website was listed there, but I can't see it right now. So it's diversityonboard.ca for the national program, and when you go there, you can access each city's information and get connected. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Johanna. There's a slide coming up that's got your contact information on it. I put it right at the end, but maybe
okay.
Why don't we just let people have a look at that right now in case you want to jot down any of that information. As I said, though, these slides will be, the whole webinar is being recorded and it'll be available on the website, but also the individual presenters' slides will be available as well as PDFs. And we're going to put a lot of this information together and create a resource paper for you as well, which will also be posted. So thank you so much, Johanna. That was a wonderful description of a very important program. And I know it's been around for a while because I've had contact with it in respect to recruiting for our board in the past. So that brings us to the end of the presentations. And now we've got a little bit of time left. We've got about 20 minutes left for some questions. There were a couple of questions that were given to us on the registration form. So why don't we start with those? And other people, feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and we'll come back to that. So one of the questions was, how, in your opinion, do austerity measures apply to nonprofit community agencies affect civic engagement? So I'm going to throw that out to our presenters, and perhaps you can unmute yourself. And does anybody have a response to that? Or in our audience, one of the participants, if you've got a response, please type that in the chat box.
Sure. It's Rebecca here. I feel that the austerity measures, it's across the country in regards to funding for a lot of organizations, but I don't think that prohibits any kind of civic engagement. I think that if you want to do something in your community, you go about doing it. I never, ever worry about, what is happening with regarding funding or anything else. If you think it's so important for your community, you make it happen. You have to pull people together to do that. But I would never, austerity measures, whatever it happens to be, to, you just move it forward, and you get the people together that will make that happen. And that, to me, is civic engagement is so very, very important. You have to have the people around the table. You have to have the organizations around the table. But if you think it's something that's important that has to happen in your community, then you make it happen.
Thanks, Rebecca. Does anybody else have a comment on that question?
Hi, it's Kathy here. I think one of the challenges with the austerity measures is the reduction of resources for these kinds of things. So there may be the will and the desire for people to do things, but when resources are being cut, it reduces the ability for people to get together, for people to get involved in programs, even to have spaces to get together. So there's a number of impacts, I think, to not that it affects people's will or desire to be involved with civic engagement, but I think it affects the reality of what can actually be delivered when financial resources are constrained.
Thanks, Kathy. If anybody else has a response to that, feel free to, at this point, you can unmute your telephone if you like. Press #6. If you want to actually talk to us, that would be fine. And but you can use the chat box too. And I'll go on to the second question, but if you've got responses to the first one, please continue to respond. The second question is, when promoting civic engagement opportunities, how do you reduce the risk of upsetting government funders and potentially negatively affect future funding opportunities? Who wants to take a crack at that question?
Well, I'll jump in again. It's Rebecca speaking, and I don't think you have to upset any government funders at all. First off, you have to work within their priorities. Government funders, whatever, whether it's in Ontario, we have Trillium, we have Northern Ontario Heritage, which provides us some money in Northwestern Ontario or Northern Ontario. We have a variety of the Rural Institute. There's a number of organizations, and I can only speak for Ontario, but I do know that there's the FedNors, which is the regional funding organizations through the federal government, and that's across the country of Canada. So I think that there's a number of organizations, but they always have a criteria. What are they going to fund in this year? Or maybe they have a 3-year plan or whatever it is. So if you're an organization, you want civic engagement, and you say, how can I go to our funders who have the larger dollars, which, by the way, are all taxpayers' dollars, but that's another discussion. The point is that you have to work within their framework, and that's what I think the most important thing is, so that when you're applying for dollars, you work within that. But I don't know that you really risk upsetting them. Government agencies are set up for that. I go for money for all kinds of things. It's not just diversity that I work in, and it's a variety of other things. And I never have had a problem with upsetting government funders, as long as you go along with them and work with them. I think that's the most important thing. If you want to have something done at a civic engagement at a local level, then you go to the funder, the potential funder, and talk to them right at the starting gate, not midway through and say, oh, we need funding. We have to get funding right at the start, and how do we work with your government agency to make that happen so that they know that that's coming down the tube. They're then going to work with you and help with the application, with making sure that, the right people are at the table, et cetera. So I'm repeating myself, and I don't mean to do that, but I don't think you can upset them as long as you work with them. That's the most important thing. That would be my comment on that one, Laura.
Well, that sounds like very astute advice, Rebecca. Thank you for that. Does anybody else have a response to that? Does anybody have experience with upsetting government people?
Hi, it's Johanna.
Hi, Johanna.
Yeah, maybe we are funded by the City of Hamilton as well, and in recent years, because of there has been funding reduction, and there are, when it comes to our conversation cafes, for example, we have to it has limited our capacity, so we try to come up with a solution by partnering with other organizations who might have the funding to do that, and also when it comes to issues that we want to engage. For example, there's an example of carding, which has been an issue in Hamilton with the police, and what we did, because that is kind of the city, and we didn't want to upset, so what we did is we engaged the police, and we have been providing them diversity and inclusion training. So that's one example, I think.
Yes, very good. Anyone else?
Hi, it's Kathy here, and just great advice from Johanna and Rebecca about engaging with the funders. I think one of the concerns perhaps the person who posed the question might have is, when you're criticizing government policies or decisions, we need to be careful about how we go about doing that and how we engage with them. Certainly, there comes times when governments do things that we may not agree with from an inclusivity point of view, and certainly social media is an area where people can get themselves into hot water where they might make comments. So it's about being prudent and astute and reasonable in the comments that we're making in public spheres. And as Johanna and Rebecca both said, engaging with the organizations to help them improve if you think that there's something that they need to improve on. But just, publicly shaming them if they're funding you is probably about one of the worst things you could do.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. Is there any other questions that anybody would like to ask? Well, then I think we can close it up. Thank you so much for participating. I'd like to thank the presenters for taking the time to be with us today to tell us about their work. I think they were giving us some wonderful examples of civic inclusion or civic engagement initiatives for civic inclusion initiatives. So that was a very interesting juxtaposition there. And I think they've given us a lot to consider. I think there's tons of information here. I'm going to have quite a task putting it all together in the resource sheets, but I'm looking forward to that as well. I'd like to thank all the participants for attending and for sending in your questions and for participating on the chat box. That was very helpful. We had some good resources being mentioned there, and I really like the way people connect with each other. So when we close this webinar, you'll be automatically directed to a very brief evaluation form. Please help us out by taking a couple of minutes to complete the form. Thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you.